Hello. I hope you're all been able to join online without any problems. My name is Dr. Lincoln Blumell, and I'm the instructor in this adult religion class titled After the New Testament, The History of Christianity for the First 300 Years. I welcome you all and understand we have a little bit of an international audience, and so I'm a little bit intimidated about that, but also very excited. What we're going to be doing for the next 8 classes is really just looking at the early history of the early Christian church for the first 300 years, and really just kind of skimming the surface. There is so much we could delve into. In fact, I teach a similar course to what we're going to be doing here at BYU, where I teach it for 3 hours a week for an entire semester, and we still don't get through nearly everything we would like to. So the point of this is just to get in and to really familiarize you with some of the resources, some of the stories, and really the history of the early Christian church. Just a note for those of you who are watching live, maybe some days you can't do that. You will be able to access this lecture. It is recorded, and in fact, I understand just today that in fact it will be up for the duration of the 8-week course period. So you can access that during any time. And so with that introduction then, let's jump into the material because there's an awful lot we want to work our way through. And so we'll just begin with slides and I will begin speaking. So as we look here at the first few hundred years of the church, I think very often as Latter-day Saints, when we look at this period, we kind of dismiss this. You know, the sense I get as I teach here at BYU is we kind of read the New Testament and then we kind of jump because there's an apostasy and then we kind of start again around 1820 or 1830. And pretty much what takes place for, 1800 or so years, we know very little about, maybe know a little bit about the Reformation. But for the most part, we say, well, that's kind of just chunked in the Great Apostasy and we want to then return to the Restoration. Yes, there's an apostasy, but notwithstanding, I think there's still an awful lot we can learn about the early church. And I think there's a lot of very faithful examples of early followers in the first few centuries. In fact, just to reiterate this point, let me share with you a quote that was made by Joseph Smith that I think is really instructive as we think about these first few centuries of the early church. He was given a copy of a very famous work written in the 16th century called, it's called the Book of Martyrs or Fox's Book of Martyrs, which was written by an English cleric, John Fox. And in this work, he kind of provided an overview of Christianity, really kind of focusing on persecution and those who've been faithful witnesses in various ages. And so in the first chapter or two, he starts out with the early church, talks about the apostles, the martyrdom of early apostles, and kind of goes forward from there and talks about, some stories of early Christians. And really the focus is more on what takes place more in Fox's own time in the 15th century. But it was quite a popular work for a time, and in Joseph Smith's day, it was actually a copy was loaned him by a member of the 70, Edward Stevenson. And after reading this, at least the first few chapters, he was very impressed. Then he made the following statement, which I've recorded here for you on this slide. He says, quote, "I have, by the aid of the Urim and Thummim, seen those martyrs, and they were honest, devoted followers of Christ, according to the light they possessed, and they will be saved." Unquote. I think this is quite profound, right? Joseph, talking about those who lived in, a previous time, may not have been on the earth when the fullness of the gospel was there, but nonetheless did the best they could with the light they had. He said, well, these people will receive, salvation. And so one of the things I want you to think about as we kind of work through the history of the early church for the next 8 weeks is to keep this in mind. I'm certainly going to talk something about apostasy, but we're not just going to be driven by, well, this is apostate or this is apostate. We're going to look at the writings, learn what we can from early church history, and in some case we'll say, yeah, clearly, there is some truth here, or clearly, this maybe individual writer is clearly doesn't have the full, truth of the gospel. But nonetheless, I think we can look at their examples, and there'll be an awful lot to glean from that. And so just keep this statement in mind as we work through this material. Now, to begin, I want to talk a little bit about the New Testament. In fact, probably for the next 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about the New Testament period, because what we're going to do here is we're going to move from the New Testament then into the early church, right, the late first century, and kind of go through the second century, then into the third, and then ultimately into the fourth century at the conclusion of this course. So up on this slide, you see here, right, all the writings, right, in our 27-book canon of the New Testament. We will talk a little bit about canonization a little bit later, but we have a 27-book New Testament. There's a couple things I want you to be aware of in this slide. The main thing is when you look at the writings here, right, we have a pretty good idea, right, roughly when Jesus' ministry occurred, right, the late 20s, right, maybe even into the early 30s AD. And we also have a pretty good idea of approximately when Paul wrote his letters. So we can say Paul starts writing his letters. Probably the earliest letter is probably 1 Thessalonians, maybe it's Galatians. Last letter, right, we have, right, 2 Timothy. But these are all probably written in about a 20, at most maybe a 25-year window from sometime in the mid to late 40s up until the early to mid 60s. So we have a pretty good idea on that, because we have Acts that we can kind of figure out where Paul is. There's reference to governors that we know of that we can kind of, plot things out on a timeline, and we have a pretty good idea, right? So that's why we have Paul's letters there, probably late 40s to early 60s. Beyond Paul's letters, right, the other half of the New Testament, because again, literally over half the New Testament, right, are letters attributed to Paul. We have these other writings like the Gospels, or what are known as the Catholic or general epistles. We have Revelation, or what's called an Apocalypse. These are very hard to date. And I'm trying to provide a little schema here of dating, because we're going to start putting in some other texts here in a little bit of what we have now kind of beyond these writings as we get into the period after the New Testament. So we can say, right, Paul's writings kind of fit in, and they accord with his ministry from the late 40s to early 60s. But when you look at the Gospels, for example, right, we have 4 of them, right, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all depict Jesus' life. But when exactly they were written, right, it is kind of open for some debate. In fact, in this slide here, I give you kind of the general dates you'll often find, for example, in a textbook. But I put a question mark next to every single writing because it's not entirely secure when exactly something was written. For the most part, the general view, right, in scholarship is probably it's a few decades after the death and resurrection of Christ that things like the Gospels were written, and that may well be the case. I'm always a little bit skeptical of that, exactly how can we pinpoint a date of something. And the reason why I bring this up here, and I want to, kind of have this introduction to the class in this way, is because when you think of dating like a gospel, right, Matthew or Luke, we don't know exactly when they were written. I think it's pretty clear they're written after Mark, because I think there's a good case to be made that Matthew and Luke are actually drawing upon Mark. And Luke in his prologue in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, even tells us that, in fact, he's using other writings. And I think it's pretty clear one of these writings is the Gospel of Mark. But in terms of trying to establish a date, the way that most scholars date these today is they'll find a reference and say, well, there's a reference here in the text of something. We know this event happened about this time, so therefore this writing must have taken place after that event took place, right? And one of the big ways to date at least some of the books in the New Testament, and give us an idea of this, for the Gospels, for example, is Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem. We won't get into this, but in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, Jesus prophesies of the destruction of Jerusalem. And this indeed happens. In fact, we're going to talk about this today. It takes place with the destruction of the temple taking place in August of AD 70. And people read that, scholars read that and say, okay, well, if Jesus is talking about this, they say, and this included in this writing, well, taking a very secular view is, well, Jesus couldn't have known the future, therefore all these texts must be written later. This is why here in this schema, right, you have Matthew, Luke, written a little bit later, or so many people think. But I just want to have people pause before you rush to that conclusion. And the reason why I want people to think about this for a moment, and this is why ultimately I put a question mark next to every single text just about in the New Testament in terms of when exactly it was written, is let's just look at this section in the Doctrine and Covenants for a moment. Okay, now I've put a bar there over what section this is. But let's say all we had was this section, right? It's a very short one. It's only 8 verses. And we're trying to figure out, okay, when was this written, right, using this really kind of rigorous historical method? And I'm going to show you something here that will hopefully make you rethink some of the dates of the early New Testament texts. So what you do is you start reading the text and you look in verse 1 there, and you'll notice there it mentions South Carolina. So if a scholar, you'd say, okay, well, South Carolina, right, became a state on March 26, 1776. Therefore, it has to be written after that date. That's, of course, really broad. You'd read on to verse 3 and you'll say, okay, wait a second here. It's talking about a war. In fact, there's going to be an outbreak of a war between the southern states and the northern states. You say, okay, this is the Civil War, right? This is 1861, 1865. So having read this text, right, if you were removed from this historically, right, hundreds of years or even thousands like we are with the New Testament texts, as a scholar you might say, this text could not have been written before 1861 and probably even somewhat later until after the event took place, i.e. the Civil War. Now what's interesting is you might all know this is section 87, and we know for a fact that section 87 was actually written when? Well, December 25th, 1832. That's about 30 years earlier. And so what I want to kind of bring to your attention here is when you think about these writings, the dates of these writings, and we're going to then start slotting in some of these other writings here momentarily, is just because an event is, right, we're reading this as scriptures prophesied of, we really take prophecy seriously. And so that's not really our guiding, criterion for how we date something. And I think when you look at section 87, that ought to give you pause, right, as we read this as scripture, right, where you have a text that's clearly written in 1832, but it's talking about events going to take place some 30 years later. Now, hopefully I've just illustrated that point there, but anyway, we'll kind of work with this, right? Here's the writings of the New Testament. I think it's widely agreed, right, in the first century, all the writings that make up the New Testament are written. And there's going to be some others that we're going to see. Now, as we start moving from, right, the New Testament period into now what's going to take place after the New Testament, let's just think for a moment about what does the New Testament itself tell us, right? When does it kind of end? When you look at the writings in the New Testament, really what you're getting for narrative is the last writings really end in the 60s. So the book of Acts, for example, covers about a 32-year period from the resurrection, right, we'll say circa AD 30, up until around the year AD 62. And some of Paul's last, letters are written in prison, presumably while he's in Rome, there in the early 60s. And what we're getting in the New Testament is you think after the resurrection, right, the church really starts off in Jerusalem. And then as you read Acts, and Acts is really our only source that we have, right, it's the main one we have to kind of look at the history and the growth of the early church, is once a decision is made, and this is Acts 10, that the gospel message is not just for Israelites, but is also for Gentiles, you then see, right, and this is especially where Paul becomes very important, but certainly others, is you then see the spread of the gospel, right? Starts spreading out to Cyprus, to Asia Minor, modern Turkey, or to Greece, or to Rome, to Crete. In fact, Paul wants to go and preach in Rome. Whether he ultimately gets there, well, not to Rome, in Spain, but whether or not he gets to Spain, we don't ultimately know. But there's this kind of big spread. And really kind of the text of the New Testament, really, it kind of, the narrative really finishes off in the 60s, maybe as late as AD 70, depending on the letters that you're reading. Even if perhaps they're written later, very often they're talking about an earlier period. And here is kind of a map of at least the places we know, right, from the New Testament, where you have communities of early Christians. So what we want to do is kind of now start moving forward beyond this, AD 60s into the 70s, 80s, 90s, then into the 2nd century, and see what we can know about the early church. Now there is a really important event I want to talk about that has a big impact for the early church after the New Testament period, okay? And what this event is this is the first Jewish revolt against Rome. Which has actually disastrous consequences for Jews in Judea. And this is actually prophesied of, as I said before, right, in the Gospel. So let's just say a couple words about that and some of the challenges it's going to pose for the early church, but also what it's going to do with the early church when we think about this revolt and the consequences of this. So this revolt breaks out in AD 66, and it's a really significant one, as we're going to see. Now, one of the things we have for this revolt, and we're really lucky, is that we actually have an eyewitness ancient source who was actually there and gave multiple first-hand accounts in various works of what was going on. And I want to briefly just introduce you to this source. The writer was a Jewish writer by the name of Josephus, or Flavius Josephus. And Josephus was born sometime around AD 37, dies sometime probably around the turn of the 1st, 2nd century, maybe around 100. And he actually ends up being a prisoner of war during this revolt. Eventually is freed, will act right as basically a translator for Roman forces as they are reconquering Judea. And after the revolt will go and settle in Rome and will write various historical works. 4 of them have survived. We have a work called The Jewish War, which he wrote probably a decade or so after the Jewish revolt, where he talks about what happened as an eyewitness, both as he was captured and then what happened and how Jerusalem fell. And he gives the reasons for why this revolt took place. He writes a work called The Jewish Antiquities, which is kind of a history in 20 books for really Greek and Roman authors telling him about the history of the Jews, where for the first 12 books he goes back and retells the Old Testament and adds a whole bunch of really interesting additions. And then from book 13 forward really talks more about his own day moving up to the end of the 1st century. He writes an apologetic work against a man called Appian, who was spreading slanders against the Jews. And then he writes a small autobiographical work. And in these works, right, we're seeing a lot about daily life in Judea, not only before the revolt and in New Testament times, but what also happens afterward. And he gives a very detailed account of this revolt. And so let's say a couple of words about what he says about this revolt, and then we'll kind of see how this is kind of leading us into this period after the New Testament. So when you read Josephus's Jewish War, that's where he really gets into why this revolt broke out. And it's a rather apologetic work. He's trying to explain to a Roman audience, look, we revolted, we should not have done that. But he does say, well, there were some reasons why we did this. And so one of the big reasons he says is, look, the Roman governors were horrible, right? They didn't understand us. They were really incompetent. So this is one of the reasons he gives. And that's kind of an overriding theme of the narrative, right, of the Jewish War. But something that's really interesting about the Jewish War is he also says, okay, and you find little, hints here and there in this long work, in this Jewish War of why it took place, is he says, well, we were mistakenly, thought as a Jewish people, as you see here in this quote, that one of our own would come forth and would basically rule the whole world. And he talks about there's an ambiguous oracle. So he says there was this kind of prophecy among us, and we took this prophecy to refer to us. Well, what's interesting here is he's clearly saying here, right, a prophecy, and it's rather ambiguous about one of us is going to come forward and rule the world. Well, this is clearly messianism, right? This idea of, a Messiah is going to come, and probably the traditional notion is that somebody's going to come and they're going to throw off, right, our Roman overlords and establish, right, a theocracy or an independent, right, Israel, like it was before. And Josephus here, he doesn't want to talk about messianism a lot, but he clearly alludes to this. And so this is one of the reasons why the revolt started. And so what he says, as he goes on, he says, well, this revolt really, people are thinking about this, right? There's been, bad administration. There's been kind of mounting tension between Jews and Roman authorities. He says, well, it really became official when the high priest determined that in the temple they would no longer offer sacrifices on behalf of the emperor. Because that was really kind of the first thing that really led to this revolt and was very dramatic. And then it really got going. So it starts here in AD 66. The revolt gets going. They drive off, right, the procurator, who was a man called Gessius Florus, and a nearby legate from Syria called Cestius Gallus comes down with troops to try to quell this initial revolt by the Jews. They actually defeat him. They rout him and the forces he brings. He barely escapes his life. And now this revolt really is in full swing. Okay? And what happens, this revolt is going to be very successful for a couple years. And if you're wondering, well, what enables this to be so successful is think about ancient speed of communication. Cestius Gallus, once his forces are routed in Judea, he can't just get on the phone or email and say, okay, we have a problem, Emperor. The emperor at this point would have been Nero. Judea is in full-on revolt, right? We tried to quell this, but we couldn't do this. It's going to take, at least, right, probably somewhere between 4 to 8 weeks for word to go from Antioch to Rome to say, look, Judea is in full-on revolt. They're going to have to make a decision about how they're going to do with this. In this case, what Nero does, he says, look, let's send our best general. The best general at the time was actually up in Britain, who was a general by the name of Vespasian. And so he's going to marshal Roman forces, in total about 4 legions plus auxiliary troops. And it's going to take him the better part of 2 years before all these forces arrive right in the vicinity of Syria. So they're going to arrive around AD 68. So this revolt now has gone on for 2 years. Okay. Once they arrive, and there's this huge force of probably about 60,000 troops, they're going to slowly make their way out of the north. Vespasian brings along his son Titus. They're going to go down to a place called Tyre, then to Ptolemais. And the revolt, right, is all the way up into the Galilee. And they're going to start by putting down the revolt in the Galilee. And the Galilee is really just a series of small villages. And so they're going to do this actually rather quickly. These small villages, even, banding together, aren't going to offer much resistance to Roman forces. And in fact, they're taking a very brutal policy where more or less they're wiping out whole villages at a time. And so what people end up doing is they realize these Roman forces are coming, they're being very brutal with the suppression of this revolt, is they begin leaving the Galilee, at least those who were involved in the revolt, and they begin to flee en masse to Jerusalem. And what happens after a relatively short time after putting the revolt down in Galilee, right, these forces then move down toward Jaffa or Joppa, right, as you have in the New Testament, and then ultimately now make a siege on Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem at this point, right, we're here into about 69 AD. It has, thousands more people than it usually has because all these refugees have been fleeing down to Jerusalem. So it's actually well fortified. It is a walled city. And what happens, this Roman force tries to take the city, but they simply can't do it. After a number of attempts, they can't take the city. And so the plan is devised whereby they're going to set up a blockade around the city. And they're going to say, nothing's going to go in, nothing's going to go out. And eventually, as you can imagine, right, in this, months go by, there's no supplies coming in, shortages of supplies begin to occur, and there's going to be all kinds of problems going on in the city. In fact, what's interesting, we're told from Josephus, is in fact, in some ways, factionalism breaks out, and basically there's kind of like a civil war taking place inside the city, as different factions fight one another for power, but also for very limited resources. In fact, when you think about what Josephus narrates here, and it's quite brutal, this really ought to take you back to Matthew 24, but especially Joseph Smith, Matthew 24, where Jesus talks about an abomination of desolation and talking about the hardships that are going to Israel's going to undergo in this period. Well, in these really difficult circumstances, right, where there's food shortage, right, there's sickness, there's problems going on, eventually Roman forces are able to, right, breach the walls of the city. Right now, by the way, we're now well into the year AD 70, and a huge, battle ensues in Jerusalem, and those fighting against Roman forces, right, will basically barricade themselves into the Temple Mount. Eventually, Roman force will surround the Temple Mount and eventually breach the walls there. And Josephus talks about this kind of last stand that takes place in the month of August of AD 70 against, Jewish forces against Roman forces, where Jewish forces are thoroughly routed. And what takes place is the destruction of the temple. Now, in his Jewish war, Josephus says it was on accident that the Roman forces, set the temple on fire, and then burned it down and then tore it down. But I think it was probably a very deliberate act. But this is really significant, right? This August of AD 70, because you have a temple, and then after August of AD 70, there is no more temple. And this is precisely what Christ prophesied was going to come to be. And as we think about, the post-New Testament period, this is kind of one of the first really defining moments or watershed moments in the early church. Whereas in Judaism, historically, had relied on a temple. In fact, you can't, right, really follow the law without a temple. Now, of course, Judaism evolves, right? And Rabbinic Judaism and modern Judaism, they haven't had a temple since then. They've evolved and they've adapted. But early on, this is very difficult. What we're going to see here in Christian writing of the next century or so after the New Testament is saying, look, this is really a sign that God has rejected old Israel, i.e., the Jews, and that in fact there's now a new covenant people, the church. They're now a new people. And so this is going to become a really important defining point as we get into the period after the New Testament. There is a story related, albeit somewhat later, by an early Christian that says that before Roman forces came and encircled Jerusalem, that those members who were living in the city were warned by a prophecy to leave the city in advance. And according to this source, it says that they left and that Christians dwelt in a city in the Decapolis, which are 10 Greek cities, which never partook in the revolt, and so therefore there was never any harsh Roman measures taken against them. And so in large part, this source says that the church was unaffected by that. But this really kind of sets the tone for the post-New Testament period, right? You're in a world now where there is no temple. And Christians will say, well, this is a sign, right, of God's, right, kind of vengeance because you rejected the Christ. And of course, right, the gospel message saying, right, there is no more need of sacrifice, right, this will really feed into this. Jews at this point are probably still hoping the temple will be rebuilt. In fact, we'll talk more about this as we get to the second centuries, as there are going to be some attempts by Jews to rebuild the temple in later decades. Now, with that, in mind, let's look here at some of our early writings now that probably begin to appear, right, after AD 70, that aren't included in the New Testament, and that constitute, right, some of our earliest evidence for Christianity outside of the New Testament. And one thing I just want to add here is it is pretty clear, right, we have this 27-book New Testament, that these are not every book that was written, right, at the time. In fact, it's very clear we know of lost books in the New Testament. So let me give you an example. We know of at least a handful of Paul's letters, for example, a letter to the church at Ephesus, a letter to the church at Laodicea, and a letter to the church at Corinth, which is actually lost. And so I'm imagining, right, we have, 14 letters attributed to Paul. I could imagine there's probably many other letters, right? We know of 3 for sure letters that are lost, but probably others that you could potentially have been part of the New Testament but get lost. And certainly I could imagine that maybe Paul was not alone. Probably others wrote letters, right? We have letters from John, right? We have letters of Peter. But I could have imagined other early texts that are probably written, but again, never make it into the canon or are lost not long after they are written. Now, as we start to move right to this period after the New Testament that's going to help us understand the New Testament church a little bit better, one of the first writings that's thought to belong to this post-New Testament period is called the Didache. It is a Greek text. In fact, just as a note on this, every book in the New Testament is written in Greek. And for really the first about 200 years, really till about the year, right, AD 200, it is overwhelmingly Greek. When you get into the late 2nd century and into the 3rd century, we do have some remains of Latin writers. We'll talk about somebody like Tertullian and others who will write in Latin, but it's really overwhelmingly Greek. And in fact, I'd really say it's overwhelmingly Greek up through the 4th century. And then probably get into the 4th and 5th century, it probably becomes a bit more even as you get with Greek and Latin writers. But really, all early Christian materials are all written in Greek. And so we have this writing that gets called the Didache, which in Greek means teaching. And it's allegedly a teaching of the 12 apostles. We'll talk more about that. Another work that we have, right, that kind of, helps fill in this post-New Testament period is a work called 1 Clement. There's also a 2nd Clement. We'll just talk about a little bit about 1 Clement today that's allegedly written by an early bishop in Rome. And so we're going to talk about that. And then probably, I would say, our most secure early writing where we can say, okay, we can kind of date this, I think, fairly securely. And it's a series of 7 letters. It's written by a bishop in Antioch. This is the same Antioch that we find Paul spending a lot of time at, and Barnabas. And these are the epistles of Ignatius of Antioch, who's a bishop there in the first part of the 2nd century. And we have 7 letters that are written by him to various churches in modern-day Turkey or ancient Asia Minor as he is being taken as a prisoner to Rome. And so these texts are among the earliest that we have that are post-New Testament texts. And so let's start talking about these and kind of catch some of the glimpses they're telling us about the early church. Now, there are some other writings. I'm going to select these because these are probably the earliest. But this group of writings that kind of we learn about the early church beyond the New Testament, they have become known under the title of the Apostolic Fathers. And what the Apostolic Fathers are, it's a collection of texts. In fact, you can easily go online and Google this, and there are free English translations of writings that belong to this corpus of texts. But this title is given them because it's thought that these people, that the apostles were their fathers. And so early Christians thought, okay, these people writing in this kind of, first generation of the New Testament, the apostles were the ones who instructed them, or so they believed. And so this is why you get, right, these texts kind of fit into this, under this heading called the Apostolic Fathers. And again, as you look at these writings here, they can be quite different. Yes, there are letters, but there's also apocalypses. There are sermons that we have, right? In total, probably a collection of about 7 or 8 documents in total that belong to this first generation of the church. And so let's start by looking at a couple of these here. Let's start with the Didache, because this is a really interesting one, because this text does begin by purporting to come from the apostles themselves, and we'll talk about that. So what the Didache is, again, it's hard to say when exactly this was written. Again, I probably should put a question mark next to the date there, but it's generally agreed it's quite early. Now, the way this text was found is this wasn't found right through some ancient, find like the Dead Sea Scrolls. But as you see there on your slide on your left, it was found actually in an 11th century manuscript in Jerusalem. And so there was, scholars, some time ago going through, back in the 19th century, going through manuscripts. And I know a manuscript that comes from the 11th century sounds quite old, but it's still nearly 1,000 years after the New Testament period. And while he was going through this codex, he came across this work that was attributed to the 12 apostles, called the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles. And this is the only complete copy we have of this. And so work's been done on it by scholars, A lot of work's been done on it over the last century and a half. And it's widely believed that, probably not maybe coming from the apostles directly, but probably relates to the early church. If it's not as early maybe as some of the later texts of the New Testament, it might probably be shortly thereafter. And it's a really interesting text that's divided into 3 sections. We can't go through this, in detail, but what this text begins with is it's written, allegedly by the 12 to members of the church, and it's kind of a warning to them of things they should be doing as early members. And so it starts off by saying, look, there are 2 ways. There, is the way that leads you to God, and there's the way that leads you away from God. And something that's interesting here is when you think about what is being articulated here, and if you're familiar with the New Testament, you'll say, well, something similar is said in the Sermon on the Mount, There's a road, There's 2 ways. Really, this is in Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. And as you read this text, you quickly realize that, in fact, there are a lot of reminiscences and echoes of the Sermon on the Mount. And so it's very concerned, that members are following the straight path that leads to God, and not the large and broad path as described in the Sermon on the Mount, that leads away from God. And so it begins by focusing on what members should and should not be doing. And so you'll find some of the instruction that's given there in the Sermon on the Mount, but there's also other instruction that's given that you don't find as clearly in the New Testament. So we will talk a lot about infanticide. and how Christians should avoid this. It also talks about, avoiding the use of drugs and sorcery in a much more detailed level than you find anywhere in the New Testament. And something that's interesting about this early text, and I think this is kind of indicative of early Christianity, kind of at least for a few centuries, is when you read early Christian texts, right, we often talk a lot about theology, right? Theology, right? Theos in Greek is God, so it's kind of like, it's the study of God or understanding, right, who God is. This is a theological study. When we think about theology, right, we often think about orthodoxy. It's another word we're going to talk about, right, which is correct belief. What's the correct belief about God? And this will become really important later in Christianity, right? What do we believe about Christ? What do we believe about God? Especially when we get down to some creeds and some confessions and articles of faith that we'll be seeing in later centuries. But one of the things you find in early Christian material is, yes, there is some concern about theology. And I would say, I think orthodoxy, or emerging orthodoxy, but something that you even find more, certainly in the Gospels, is that Jesus certainly is very concerned about what people are doing, which would be orthopraxy. So orthodoxy is correct belief, right? Orthopraxy is correct action, doing the right thing. And so this text is really concerned about Christians doing the right thing, what they should be doing and what they should not be doing. Now what's interesting here in this text, the beginning, right, telling what they should be doing, and we find some injunctions that aren't mentioned in the New Testament, is something that I will just mention just really one passage from this text. But look at this little interesting reference here. It's in the Didache 1:6. And it says this, "But has also been said concerning this, let your gift sweat in your hands until you know to whom to give it." Unquote. And so it's quoting something. Here it's early on saying, you ought to be charitable as Christians, right? And here you might kind of tie this back into Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. And then it says this saying, look, you've heard this, right? You got to let your gift sweat in your hands until you know to whom you should give it. Meaning you got to really think about who you ought to give your charity to, or your quote-unquote alms, right, from the New Testament. Well, some people think that, in fact, this is actually quoting Jesus. It doesn't say this in the text, but in the section where it's given here, it's not unlikely that perhaps the author had in mind that, in fact, Jesus made this statement. Now, what's interesting here is if you go back, you look in the Gospels, you never find a statement like this. And this lets me introduce something we're going to be coming across here over the next couple of weeks, is as you start reading early Christian material outside of the New Testament, you're going to find Christians saying, oh yeah, don't you remember what Jesus said, or it was reported to us that Jesus said this? And you'll go back and say, wait a second, this does not appear anywhere in the New Testament. And so what you're finding here, potentially, at least in the Didache, is what's known as an extra-biblical statement of Jesus. These become known as agrapha, means they're unwritten, or in the singular it's agraphon, an unwritten statement of Jesus that doesn't actually appear in the Gospels, right? Now, as Latter-day Saints, right, this should really come as no surprise. There are many things Jesus both did and certainly said that do not appear in the New Testament. I think John, at the end of his gospel, more or less sums this up where he says, look, if everything Jesus said and did were recorded, not the world itself could contain all the books. And so, we would say, there's conceivably could be stories and things Jesus did that don't make it into the Gospels. In fact, I can give you one example of this, right? If you go read Acts chapter 20, 35, this is when Paul is in Miletus, and he's teaching the elders of the church of nearby Ephesus. He says, don't you remember what the Lord said, quote, it is a more blessed thing to give than to receive, unquote. Well, if you go back and read the Gospels, Jesus never says that. Or if he said that, it wasn't recorded. And so Paul, and I would probably accurately, is recording a statement Jesus made but never gets recorded in the Gospels. What we're going to see is with this statement here in the Didache, or one in Justin Martyr, we're going to see statements attributed to Jesus that aren't there. Now, of course, we wonder, is every statement here that's attributed to Jesus actually come from Jesus? Well, it's hard to say. But I think it's interesting, you do begin to have a collection of sayings that begin to emerge in these later writings about both deeds as well as sayings that Jesus made. And perhaps one of the earliest ones could be here in the Didache. As you move into the second part of this early book, and this book I'd really call it kind of an instruction manual for the early church. When you really get into chapter 6 right through 15, it gives lots of instructions here regarding the church, with practice and the order of the church. It will talk a lot here, for example, about, it will talk about the Eucharist. What the Eucharist is the sacrament, how the Eucharist should be administered. It talks about how baptism should be administered. This is quite interesting. One of the things that it prefers is that baptism be done in, quote, living water, unquote. Living water means water that's actually moving, like a stream or a river as opposed to maybe a lake. That's the preference. It can be done without it, but that's kind of a preference. It's kind of interesting. We're seeing perhaps some early practices here in the church. It also talks about early apostles and prophets. Now, just a note on the word apostle, as we're going to see here in some of these early texts that are post-New Testament, but as well as in New Testament texts. Whenever we think of the word apostle as Latter-day Saints, we always think about, well, one of the 12. And in the New Testament, when it mentions apostle, often it's referring to one of the 12. And this is where I will often say that's kind of a capital A apostle. What you also get in the New Testament, but also especially in writings after the New Testament, are what I call is lowercase a apostle. And this would just be missionaries, right? This Greek word apostolos literally means one who is sent forth. And it's very clear there are early missionaries. They're called apostles. They're not one of the 12, but it's going to give instructions regarding these missionaries that have this same name. And it's even going to warn about real apostles and quote-unquote false apostles. And what are the sign of false apostles? And so it's kind of interesting as it gives some instructions of how early members can tell the difference between a real apostle and a false apostle, or between a real prophet and a false prophet. One of the things you need to keep in mind here with these early writings, at least those that we have from the early church, is they will talk about prophets, but not always in the same way we talk about the prophet. They'll more or less talk about a prophet as one who is being moved by the Spirit. And so there'll be members, right, in the early church where they'll talk about they feel this person has a greater abundance of the Spirit and will speak, right, in prophecy. When I think about the New Testament, probably somebody like this would be Agabus in the book of Acts. He prophesies, right, about a famine in the time of Claudius. He'll prophesy to Paul that he will be imprisoned if he goes back to Jerusalem. And it seems you have people who will act like this. And so it gives some instructions for general members to know the difference between a real and a false prophet. And the way this text then ends is with an apocalypse. And what an apocalypse is, in Greek, this just means a revelation, right? It literally means an unfolding or a disclosure. And what you'll often find in early Christian texts, and over time they won't have this as much, but in earlier texts it is, well, always watch and be ready for when Jesus comes back. You don't know the time, you don't know the day, you don't know the hour. He's going to come back like a thief in the night. This is language, again, you'll find in the Olivet Discourse, but also in Paul's writing, like, for example, in 1 Thessalonians, right, 4 and 5. And so you'll find right this at the end of this text, saying, watch and be ready, he's going to come back. And so that's just a really brief summary, but I think this is a really important text that, again, the only version we have of this now dates to the 11th century, and probably it was changed somewhat, but I think there's a good case to be made. This is probably among one of the earliest pieces, right, produced by the church that didn't make it in the New Testament that belongs to this post-New Testament age. Now, the next text I want to talk about is 1 Clement, okay? And this here is different, right? Whereas the Didache, I'd say, is kind of like a manual for the early church, 1 Clement now is a letter, and this letter is supposedly written by a bishop of the church in Rome, okay? So let's talk about this letter and just kind of give a little bit of an overview of this. There's also a really interesting reference to this letter I want to talk about briefly. And this is actually quite long. This letter probably is about 50 pages in length. It's written, as you can see on this map, by the church in Rome over to the church in Corinth, okay? And it doesn't actually give the name of the author in the letter itself. It's by tradition that we have in the early church, and it's fairly early tradition, by the way, is that there was an early bishop of Rome, as you can see here on the slide. Later Christians talk about this, but there's a tradition that the third bishop of the Church of Rome is a man called Clement, okay? In the early church, they don't count Peter as an early bishop of Rome. In fact, at least our earliest sources say that he was a bishop in Antioch. I know today, right, often you think of Roman Catholicism, counts kind of Peter as the first church in Rome. Early sources don't impute him there. Later sources will. But here, right, this third bishop, right, is Clement. And allegedly he wrote this letter to the church in Corinth. And the reason why this letter is written, I think it's really quite remarkable. We have an early letter written from Rome to the church in Corinth, is because there's a big problem going on. And this is kind of interesting, right? Because you think of our two letters we have from the church, right, by Paul to the church in Corinth, the New Testament. When you read 1 Corinthians, it's very clear that this branch of the church, I would say, is really quite dysfunctional. There's all kinds of problems going on. That's very clear in 1 Corinthians. It seems when Paul writes 2 Corinthians, there's still some problems going on, but Paul's really encouraged that it seems that some good progress has been made based on what he wrote in the first letter. Well, what we have in 1 Clement is this letter from the church in Rome, allegedly sent by Clement, to the church in Corinth. And what's going on here is right at the beginning, we learned that in fact there's been what's called, right, in Greek there's been a stasis. And what stasis literally means in Greek is rebellion. There's been a rebellion in the branch in Corinth. And as you read the letter carefully, it's pretty clear that part of the branch has revolted against the other half of the branch, and there's a big schism going on. And so what's going on in this letter, there's a big problem in the branch, is that, let's say that Clement wrote this, that he writes this letter saying, look, this branch needs to come back together, and you need to stop this rebellion. And the rebellion seems to be such, when you read the letter kind of between the lines, is that a faction in the church, presumably it seems a younger faction, has risen up against the leaders and rejected them. And when you think about this is probably a not uncommon occurrence in the early church, right? When you think about Paul's letters, right? Paul's letters, which are very situational, are dominated by problems. Whether writing to the church in Corinth, the church in Thessaloniki, right? The churches in Galatians, there are problems. He goes, he preaches, he goes somewhere else. He's now learned that they're not following what he's doing. Or there's been a falling out, so he tries to rectify that. And so this in some ways is a bit of a continuation of the themes you find in Paul's letters, where there's been a problem in the church, it's divided, and so it's kind of to bring back some unity and concord. Now what's interesting is what the author does here is he warns all about jealousy. He starts off by saying, look, right, you can't be jealous. And he's going to give all kinds of examples from the Old Testament. It's really fascinating how many Old Testament examples are given in this letter to urge this group that had rebelled against the leaders to kind of come back into the fold. I think as what I'm describing here, probably thinking, okay, apostasy. Well, this is what you're getting, right? Apostasis. If stasis is a rebellion, you're standing up. Apostasy is a total falling away. And so we're seeing some of that here in this letter, in this branch in Corinth. Now, something that's interesting that's mentioned in this letter, and this is the earliest reference we have to this in any early church literature, and I want to just do a bit of a detour on this, is when you get to, section 5, it mentions Peter and Paul. And it actually talks here that Peter and Paul were both put to death, and the reason given is because of jealousy and strife. And so it's telling, right, those who are rebelling, saying, look what jealousy has brought you to, and look what this caused. In fact, these great pillars in the church, Peter and Paul, were put to death, and it's saying the motivating factor was jealousy. And I bring this up because this is the first explicit references we have in all of Christian literature to the deaths of Peter and Paul. Okay? Let's just talk about this for a moment, right? So we do have, when you think back in the Gospel of John, right at the very end, there is a prophecy made, right, that Peter will die. And the Lord, prophesies this to him. And here, when this letter is written, it's very clear that Peter's already died, okay? The traditional date that's given, as best we can figure, right, from early Christian literature for the deaths of Peter and Paul is about 68 AD, or AD 68. And so this letter is clearly written after that, but it talks about Peter being put to death. And then later on, the tradition given about Peter is that Peter is put to death by being crucified upside down. And if you're wondering what's the reason for that, well, in a much later Christian work that's called the Acts of Peter, it's alleged, right, that when Peter is going to be crucified, that the story that's given is, well, he says, I'm not worthy to die in such a way as my Lord, and so it's done upside down. And so you'll often find paintings like this which depict this, like this very famous painting of Caravaggio. But here it doesn't mention it. It says that he's died. So Peter's died. And then it also talks about Paul. Now again, right, Paul, when you read 2 Timothy, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, is aware of his coming death. He says, my days are numbered. In Philippians he says, it's okay, maybe it's time for me that I need to depart from you and go and be with Christ. But in this case, right, we learn that Paul has died. And the tradition that's given about Paul is that because he was a Roman citizen, he was put to death by beheading. Right? Peter's not a Roman citizen, and so he could be crucified. As a Roman citizen, basically, you're afforded certain legal rights, and one of them is that you, when you are executed, right, it's in more of a quote-unquote humane way, unlike crucifixion or being, condemned to like the arena with beasts, you'd be beheaded. And so here it talks about this has already taken place. I think that's quite significant, right? The deaths of Peter and Paul. In fact, something else we learn about, when you think about, right, deaths of leaders in the church that I want to mention, if you recall, I mentioned Josephus already. And Josephus has a really remarkable story where he talks about that in the year AD 62, James, the brother of Jesus, was put to death by stoning. Now this is the James that you read about starting in Acts chapter 12 and plays a really important role in the early church in Jerusalem. And so you're beginning to see a picture here, right, of some early leaders being put to death rather violently. Now there are traditions that leaders are put to death, right, in a rather harsh way. Right, for example, Fox's Book of Martyrs that I alluded to earlier on talks about this in other later writings. But I think, certainly this case of Peter and Paul, right, we know they're put to death. Here's the first reference, right, James. I think it's kind of significant. They're significant for a couple of reasons here, right? I mentioned apostasy. When you go and read section 86, right, here's section 86, not the entire section, but a part of it. And here you have a retelling of, right, the parable of the wheat and the tares that you find in Matthew chapter 13. And the reason why I bring this up is because when this parable is now interpreted here in D&C 86, unlike Matthew 13, there's a different facet at it. Where in Matthew 13, right, there it's talking about, well, the devil comes in and sows these weeds among the good things. Here, the Lord's more explicit and says, look, what happens here is this really happened, look here at verse 3, when the apostles fell asleep or died. And so one of the things when you read section 86, and we talk about, right, apostasy, one of the things that directly connects this with is the passing of the apostles. And so, right, we know Peter and in this case, Peter and Paul put to death, quite brutally. James, whether or not James is an apostle. There's, of course, another James who is an apostle, right, the brother of John, but we already know about him from Acts chapter 12. But this seems to be when the apostles go away, real problems beset the church. This is from 86. And one of the things that I find really interesting here, right, is we're just kind of thinking on this digression about this reference to the deaths of Peter and Paul in 1 Clement, is there is an early church writer called Hegesippus, who writes in the 2nd century. Now, his writings are no longer around. He wrote, and then later Christian authors incorporated some of his writings into theirs. And there's this really interesting reference that he makes that's recorded in a later Christian writer of the late 3rd and 4th century. And so this later writer called Eusebius quotes Hegesippus, what he said in the 2nd century, and look what he says here as we relate this to section 86. Let me just read the quotation in full. Besides this, the same writer, explaining the events, adds that until then the church remained a pure and uncorrupted virgin. For those who attempted to corrupt the healthful rule of the Savior's preaching, if they existed at all, lurked in obscure darkness. And then here's the point I really want you to focus on. But when the sacred band of the apostles and the generation of those to whom it had been vouchsafed to hear with their own ears the divine wisdom had reached the several ends of their lives, Then the federation of godless error took its beginning through the deceit of false teachers who, seeing that none of the apostles still remained, barefacedly tried against the preaching of the truth the counter-proclamation of, quote, knowledge falsely so-called, unquote. I'll talk about what that knowledge, falsely so-called is in a later lecture. But look what Hegesippus just says. It's really remarkable. Writing in the 2nd century says, look, the problems that really came into this church took place when the apostles died and they couldn't stand up to those people that were, quote unquote, godless and bringing in error into the church. So I found that really fascinating, right? That you're finding in modern revelations connecting, right, apostasy, whether it's complete by this point, is clearly related, right, to a certain extent with the deaths of the apostles. And here you have a writer in the 2nd century saying, the real problems really began to creep in a whole new degree once the apostles died. And so I think that's quite significant. Now, going back to Clement, right? We have this early reference to Peter and to Paul. It goes on, we'll just urge the church in Corinth to be reconciled. Unfortunately, we don't have a follow-up letter from Clement. There's a letter called To Clement, but it's more like a sermon, and it's debatable whether it's directly related to 1 Clement. It doesn't appear to be. But again, what we're seeing here is kind of little pictures here of what's going on in the early church. When you think about the early church, right, after the New Testament, it's really quite difficult to reconstruct in some degree because we have all kinds of scattered sources. We don't have a clear picture, so we don't have everything we'd like, but we're at least getting little vignettes of what is going on. And one of the things I would say with what's going on is there's lots of good stalwart members. There's certainly some challenges, but we're seeing lots of problems and lots of factionalism going on within the early church in this first and certainly in later generations after the New Testament. What I want to at least introduce today in just the last few minutes, we're going to pick up next week, are, I would say, probably among the most significant post-New Testament writings. It's those of Ignatius of Antioch. And this is, according to early Christian tradition, the second bishop, or one of the early bishops of the city of Antioch. And according to this tradition, Peter is allegedly the first bishop of Antioch. But we really know more about him than any other early Christian after the New Testament period. And the reason why we know more about him is because he comes from Antioch, but it's because he leaves behind 7 letters. And these 7 letters that he leaves behind are addressed to churches in Western Asia Minor. Now, when you look at the churches that he writes to, Philadelphia, Smyrna, Tralles, Magnesia, Ephesus, right? He writes to Rome. He writes to a person called Polycarp. Something that maybe strikes you is, of course, in the New Testament we have letters to like Ephesus, for example, right? So Paul will write a letter there. You also have a letter addressed to the church in Ephesus. When you read, right, Revelation in chapters 2 and 3, you have 7 churches who are being addressed there in very short letters. And so here as he's going to Rome, he's writing letters to these churches. And what we learn from his letters is that, first of all, he was a bishop of Antioch, and that, in fact, he has been condemned. He's a convict. And I read the letters in such a way where basically he is being condemned for his profession as a Christian. I think that's probably the best way to read this. And so as he's being taken, right, to Rome by a band of soldiers whom he calls, quote unquote, leopards because of the way they treat him, he is permitted to write to various churches as he's making his way to Rome, where he believes he will ultimately then be put to death because he is a Christian. And he's going to say some really interesting things to the churches that talk about, right, the bishopric and talk about some early challenges in the church. And also, we'll lead into our discussion next week is, what is the status of Christians as we get into the late 1st and 2nd century? Because it's going to be awfully hard to become a Christian because there's going to be some pretty hard measures taken against them by the imperial government. And so his letters are a real treasure trove, being written sometime around AD 110 to these different churches, and kind of gives us a little glimpse into what's going on in the church at the beginning of the 2nd century. Now, instead of jumping into these letters here and having to conclude immediately, with only about a minute left in today's lecture, we're going to stop there. But if you do want to go and look at some of these sources I've talked about, whether it's the Didache or 1 Clement, or even take a look at Ignatius's letters. They're very easily found online with easily accessible English translations. And next week we're going to talk about Ignatius and then start talking about what we're seeing now in the beginning of the 2nd century, because there's some other correspondence we're going to be seeing. And something interesting here, just as we wrap up, is we're going to see now a number of non-Christians now, again in the 2nd century, starting to talk about Christians. And what are they saying about them? And so that'll be really kind of interesting. It'll give us another kind of perspective on the early church. I look forward to meeting again with you next week and hope you have a fantastic week. Take care.